Hey, worship leader, welcome back to the channel. Today I have a guest with me, Jonathan Azzarello. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm good, man. It's good to be back.
You're good. You've been on here a few times before. I
Yep.
remember, was it one or two times? I had you talk about, you wrote a book called You Are What You Worship. It's a fantastic book. I don't have it here because I loaned it out to my dad, and because it's a great book. I love that book. And I want to have you on today because you're coming out with another book. Here it is, The Greatest Worship Leader. And, we were talking before the recording. It's like, I don't want people to think we're pushing a product here, but there's a lot of good truth in here. And I want people to grab this book because it'll help them as a worship leader. As we've been talking, I was sharing that I feel like me and you are aligned on a lot of how we think, a lot of shared experiences. It's just you're really good at writing it down. So I don't have that knack, but I want to let people know there'll be a link down below to go grab this book. And yeah, it just talks about, which I haven't read the whole thing yet. So being transparent, I read the intro, read the first chapter, but I'm already behind. And you share a story at the beginning talking about your experience at a conference. But one of the little details is that you drove a 1998 Oldsmobile 88. And I know that car really well because that was my grandfather's car. He had that car. And then my first car wasn't that one, but it's similar in the look. I had a 1988 Caprice Classic, which is like the
Mm,
Chevrolet's version.
yeah.
All those cars kind of look very similar, big boxy cars. So I know the struggle. I know that wasn't the
Yeah.
point of the story, but I was like, we're already connected. Even our experiences on cars are very similar. But more importantly, just the journey of probably when we first started in worship ministry and our desires of wanting to be on stage or wanting to seek maybe something else, a spotlight differently than we do now as older worship leaders. And I think it's a good conversation to have because a lot of people are, coming into worship ministry for different reasons. And so I've noticed that I noticed that you have a heart for pouring into future worship leaders. Where does that come from?
Yeah. I mean, so Jimmy, I've been in worship ministry for like probably 12 or 13 years. And my job now versus what it used to be, I was telling you this a little bit a few minutes ago, but used to be my job was like, hey, I am the worship leader of our church. Like I would lead worship. That was pretty much it. I would lead our team directly. And now fast forward, a few years, and now my job is a lot more of like, hey, we have several campuses. So my job is like pouring into other worship leaders who lead every week and just helping them to, and honestly, a lot of them are way better than I am or ever will be already. But just being there for them to support them, encourage them. And man, that journey, I actually talk a little bit about that in the book. Just that very first time that I shared the story, the very first time that I let somebody else lead, where it was planned. There was a time I was telling you already before where I got sick one time and somebody had to fill in for me and crushed it. And then, but this specific story I tell in the book is of a time where somebody was like, hey, okay, we're talking about becoming a multi-site church, and so I need to start raising up leaders, something I wasn't very good at doing. And so I let somebody else do it. And man, it just really messed with me and got, like my false humility, which AKA genuine pride kind of came out. And man, I've learned so much through my years. And honestly, a lot of what I've learned has been through the hardest times of my life. It's funny how God does, works that way. And man, over the years, I just feel like I've become so passionate about worship ministry. I believe in it. I believe in, God's gift and the power of corporate worship and, music. And man, so I just am so like here for it. And I just really want to express, and really share the things that I've learned and help some of the younger worship leaders, not make the same mistakes I did, but and they will. And I just, a lot of this comes out of just my, my passion for worship and genuine worship. Like I wrote about in my first book, You Are What You Worship. And this one, man, kind of the heart really the heart behind it and sort of kind of the why behind it. In addition to just my passion for raising up new leaders and worship leaders specifically, I did a Bible study through the book of Matthew. And when I was reading in Matthew, Jesus said in Matthew 18:4, he says, hey, the greatest among you, talking to his disciples, the greatest among you will be like a child. And he says, hey, if you take on the lowly position, the humble position of this child, and if you accept one of these children in my name, you will be like the greatest in the kingdom. And man, I cannot tell you how long I just paused and stopped and like chewed on that. And I'm just like, man, it is so true that, and I wanted to adapt this to like worship ministry because it's so true. And you can attest to this, Jimmy, because like you said, man, I feel like we are kind of like kindred spirits in this, that we are both very passionate about raising, about pouring into worship leaders and worship ministry. And not just for the sake of being like really awesome musicians, like we want that too, but like the end game is very different. That's not the end. That's just a means to an end. And so, man, just like pondering this, what does it mean to be the greatest in the kingdom? And what does it mean to be like the greatest in the sight of the way that Jesus defined it? Because it's so easy to define greatness and maturity isn't always based on age, but for me it was, as an early 20-something-year-old worship leader, I defined greatness as like, okay, Elevation, Bethel, and only the celebrity worship leaders, only the ones who are successfully like really like known by everyone. And this book is not against celebrity worship leaders. Like I think that God has given those people a platform, and they're doing awesome things with it. But I think the pursuit of that platform, or the pursuit of like renown in itself, is only rooted in pride and idolatry. And so but a lot of us have to learn that over the course of like 5, 10, 15 years. And we get to the point where we realize, man, greatness as a worship leader is not defined by these things, but rather it's defined by these things. And the cool thing is that, like, man, it doesn't matter how big your congregation is, or how big your worship team is, or how good your voice is, or how great you are at some of these specific things. Like, you can reach a level of greatness in the sight of Jesus, which is kind of like the point, right? That doesn't require any more from you than what you already have. And so, man, that's a lot. That's a mouthful. I know that's kind of like drinking from a fire hose, but that's kind of like the heart behind all of this, man. I just really want to pour in. And man, I'm so passionate about the people on my team. And like, I wrote this honestly for my team, and I wrote this for me. I wrote this as like a kind of a marker of like who I want to be as a worship leader, and helping to define success and greatness for our team.
That's awesome. What you're saying reminds me of the part that I highlighted here. You're talking about culture of, the celebrity culture that we can see. And I know this is important because I think worship ministry attracts a certain kind of people that other positions in the church doesn't attract, like maybe a children's minister doesn't have this. They don't have a stage necessarily. So it attracts musicians because, music is a part of our job. And if you detach music from ministry, which is not a problem to pursue music as your career, like you want to be good. And then if you're writing music, you want people to hear that music. Like you said, there's nothing wrong with like celebrity culture. There's nothing wrong with pursuing that. But we have to be careful when we mix those things, because they don't mix well, because one is self-promotion. And you said therefore we promote our brand even more. This can often result in measuring our success by the amount of influence we have, rather than what we do with the influence we already have. And that hit me again. I was like, oh yeah, like we're always looking for like the next thing, but what am I doing with what God has given me today? Mm-hmm. And I think like answering that question just gets right at it, gets right to the heart of what are my motivations as a worship leader. So one, practical way I see this still happening on with me and in my team is that we have 2 services, just one location. And it's kind of a joke. The 9 o'clock service is like the sleepy service.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
not as many people at that service. A lot of times I'm like, man, I wish that the 9 o'clock people could experience the 11 o'clock crowd, because by 11 o'clock, it's like people are awake, and it's almost like even if the band performs exactly the same, the experience feels different. And so it kind of like you have to step back and measure like what is success. Like we did the same exact thing. There were less people in the first service that might have been a little more tired. But did that mean that service wasn't as successful, especially in the eyes of God? Like people still worship. And even though we felt like, man, that was a bummer. Hey, don't worry about it. We got the 11 o'clock service coming up. It's so easy to have the wrong metrics. And when you get to those questions of, man, am I being a good steward with what I have right now? It takes away those vanity metrics that we tend to think, oh, more people had their hands raised in the second service. That can't be what it's about. And it can't be worship. Success in worship ministry can't be about the fact that there was just more people in the room to create this different kind of energy. You know what I'm saying?
So true, man. That was real.
So those are some good thoughts. And so I want to get real practical towards the end of this video, this discussion, and give listeners some heart questions that they can ask themselves as kind of like a litmus test. If you can think of any, I didn't give you these up front, so no pressure, but what kind of questions can a worship leader ask themselves to kind of give them a little insight into their own heart, potentially their own idolatry? I was thinking the first question that I would ask is like, why do you want to be in worship ministry? When I audition people into the band, that's one of my questions. I know that they're auditioning either for vocals or an instrument or whatever it is, but I always ask them like, why do you want to do this? And I like to hear how they articulate, even though I've already asked them this like on a written form. I like to hear them verbally articulate like why they even want to be on the worship team. And I think it's really important to ask those kinds of questions, because is your heart for the local church and seeing people have authentic worship, or is it hard to even articulate that because maybe that's not where it is? Do you have any questions that you would want to leave with our listeners today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question to ask, and to ask yourself, like, man, why am I pursuing this thing? I mean, like, Jimmy, I love on your channel, man, like all of the ways that you equip worship, leaders, worship guitarists, and with so many things. And I think even that is kind of like, for some people, like, hey, we should pursue excellence. We should, be good stewards of what God has given us. We should play skillfully, for the Lord. But like, what is the why? What is the driving why behind it? Like, why do I want to get better? Is it so that we can make a name for ourselves, and is it so that we can, kind of be like the cool church in our city? Or, and man, we all are humans, we all are going to deal with certain levels of that. And I don't think that we need to be too rough on ourselves with that. But at the same time, like at the end of the day, it's good to ask these questions, I think, just to remind ourselves, like, hey, why am I doing this? And I think we would all know this. I mean, it's like catechisms 101. It's like, well, it's for God's glory, but even though we all know the answers to that, I think it's really good to remind ourselves, like, hey, is God glorified even when, like you said, when I walk out of that 9 o'clock service and it felt sleepy? Like, was God still glorified though with like what just took place in that room? And I'm sure you've heard testimonies just like I have of people who were in the sleepy service. And they'll come up to you afterwards and they'll be like, man, God just dealt with me during that service today. And you're like, really? Because to me, it felt like the sleepy service, and it's just like, man, God can do some crazy things. One of the chapters I write about in the book, I tell a story about this crazy, astronomically disaster of a service that we had. and yet how incredible it was, and how God uses our best, but also God uses our worst. And so, one of the questions, I ask, there's questions, or there's kind of very intentionally a set of discussion questions after every chapter, because I did want this to be a book that could be something you could go through with your team. Just to start good discussion, man. I feel like being able to talk about these things in itself is such a win for us, to be like questioning and really challenging our motives for everything we do. But I did this, and I think that going through and just asking, like, man, do I get really down? Do I get really, really upset when somebody gives me kind of like constructive criticism? Does it ruin my day when somebody says, man, you were flat today? Or now, obviously, as the worship leaders, hopefully we are not the ones saying comments like that, at least not without tact. But when somebody else, challenges and gives us, or we hear stuff about that, like, man, you're standing in a room full of other vocalists, and somebody is like, man, that vocalist crushed it today. And you're like, what about me? Like, what does that, and what does that say about us? And what does that expose about our heart posture and worship? And maybe even, what does it expose about, like, why are we even doing what we do? And so, man, I don't think these questions should be condemning for us, but only just like, they should be definitely like, hey, why, why am I doing what I'm doing? And what does that say about my worship? I read last night in Micah, I'm reading through the book of Micah, and Micah chapter 2, he's talking about these people who, they devise evil on their beds at night, and then the next morning they execute it. And man, I just was like chewing on that a little bit, and I was thinking, how much, because David wrote about meditating from our beds. And I'm like, man, how many of us, if we were to question, what do we think about when we lay our head on our pillow before we go to sleep? What does that say about what we worship truly? What does that say about who is sitting on the throne of our heart? And I think that, man, is a great question. Like, man, what do you think about at night? And what does that say about your worship? And, man, how can we dethrone whatever that thing is? Like, are we actually thinking about, like, when David in the Psalms is like, man, I meditate on your laws and on your precepts, and I think about them day and night. I'm just like, dear Lord, help me, because that is not what I think about on my bed, but I want to, And yeah. So, man, I think there's so many questions, but I think the big thing is, like, are we at least pausing and asking ourselves these questions about heart posture and motive?
I think that's great. And I kind of worded it like for new worship leaders, but kind of how you're saying, these are questions that I'm still asking myself today. It's not something that goes away. It's kind of like, we need to be asking ourselves these questions, because we might be good one week, one day, and just because of our fallen nature, pride is sneaky. It can slip in. And so these are good questions just to ask all the time. The other thing that you hit on that I was also thinking is, like, a good way to know kind of where your heart is, and it's not to condemn you, but just kind of keep you on track, is, like you said, like, how do you respond when things you feel like they don't go well, especially when those when we have the metrics that we think are special, like people raising their hands, or, oh, I could really hear them singing today. Well, I heard them singing because maybe there were more people in the room or something. Like, or when things go wrong, or the bass player doesn't play the right notes, or whatever. Like, what really, I think it's okay to be frustrated with things that don't go well when you've planned well. There's that layer of maybe frustration that might set in, but does it, like, get to you on that pride level where you just can't let it go? And I think that's the biggest thing that I've had to change. That's just a grace gift from God, because I couldn't do it on my own, would just be, wow, things were really terrible today. And that's okay. Like, at the end of the day, we're just a group of Christians coming together to pray the word, sing the word, hear the word preached. Yeah. And often I put way too much more onto that. And, like, at the end of the day, so there was we had a conference at our church, which I couldn't even attend because I was getting over COVID. But the last night, the guy who was leading worship for me was there, and the power went out in the building, and somebody like videoed the fact that they, it was pretty much dark. They had a few like those lights that come on when the power goes out, and it was just an acoustic guitar and voices. And it was like, I mean, just witnessing it on the phone through social media, I was like so upset that I missed it. And it was just like, man, that power went out. There were no words on the screen, and they were just singing hymns that everyone knew, and you could just hear voices. And I was like, see, it doesn't matter if there's no Ableton. It doesn't matter if the screen is not on. Like, at the end of the day, let's do things well, but we're just a group of believers wanting to praise Jesus. And that's what we're leading people into. And all these other things get added onto it, and it really can distract. And so that's a question I've been asking even myself as a 38-year-old worship leader now. Just had a birthday.
Happy birthday.
And like, am I okay with the things that happen on a Sunday if the word of God was preached, it was prayed, and it was sung, and the believers heard themselves singing and were encouraged? Like, that's got to be the main goal, not my guitar tone, which I love guitar tone. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I think that's got to be where our hearts go, and that's not easy, which is why we're talking about it today. So if you're listening to this today, take it from two older worship leaders who have done it and are still in it, still in the trenches. All right. So we had a lot of good discussion. We could probably talk for hours more. I'll probably have you back on the channel again because this is fun. But if you want to pick up your copy, I'll link it down below. Go pick it up. You won't regret it. Pick up the other book as well. I really love that one. You Are What You Worship. They're both great. So go pick them up. Jonathan, thanks for coming on the channel. Really appreciate you coming on here and just sharing your wisdom with us.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right, guys. See you in the next video. Bye.